So, I'm joined now by Dowshan Humzah, who's a long-term friend of mine and someone who has both incredibly deep and wide experience within marketing, but who subsequently, I suppose it's fair to say, has gone plural and has carried his marketing experience, I think, to great wider benefit to other realms of activity where marketing normally doesn't touch. And so I think his perspective as both insider and outsider. I'm always a big fan of people. And by the way, this is not a bad employment policy. If you can find people who've got, in a sense, uh, you know, uh, 1 foot in and 1 foot out of anything, you find the perspective you gain from those people is actually 4 times greater than someone who's entirely an outsider or almost equally as bad, entirely an insider. And so I thought we'd just talk for a while based on Dowshan's experience of being a marketer, starting at P&G as a recent, I think you were an LSE graduate, is that right? You joined Procter and Gamble, who are still, I think it's fair to say, pretty much the gold standard for a marketing education. And then since working at P&G, and then subsequently, I think at Orange and NTL and O2, is that right? No, hold on, I'm doing a disservice there.
I think O2 would have been great, but no, Orange, NTL became Virgin Media for a number of years, and Royal Sun Alliance, the insurance company, as well as four digital startups as well. So there's a range of experiences there.
So what's particularly interesting is taking that experience from a packaged goods company, which I think it's fair to say marketing is absolutely central to its existence, where indeed the brand manager has P&L responsibility for the brand, which is probably not common elsewhere. Um, and then you've also seen marketing in those areas of high tech. And one of the things that worries me about the growing industries of tech, finance, for example, anything essentially which has a financial, an engineering, or a technological mindset, is there tends to be a less welcoming and less respectful attitude to marketing than you'd find in, for example, a Wrigley or a P&G or a Unilever. Is that fair? I mean, there are obviously exceptions. You had a guy in Snook in Orange who was I mean, I don't know if his background was that of a marketer. I think he was an engineer, but he seemed to be an instinctive marketer. But for the most part, when you go into finance, when you go into engineering focused businesses, tech focused businesses, mathematically focused businesses, if you like, there tends to be, and it's not just me saying this, it's also Peter Thiel, for example, in the book 0 to 1, that nerds don't like marketing very much. Has that been your experience?
Partly, yes. And I think the example of Hans, and when you talk about P&G as well, is first of that love of the customer.
Yeah.
And here we are in business, we're talking about love. And it's not a word that traditionally resonates in business, love the customer, but really your role of championing the customer, using the skill that many of us marketeers have of extracting insight. But the magic is when you can go to inspiration. So when you talk about Hans Snook and Orange, it really was inspiration because we are basically predicting the future by invention. We don't know what customer needs are. There's no insight back in the day around, say, how people were using mobile phones in the late 90s and how that would develop. It was very inspirational, but that comes through an absolute love of the customer and building a vision for the future. So when we look at the skills of marketing, you now go back to P&G and being a brand manager and owning the P&L. But owning the P&L is key because you're looking at the full P&L, revenue and cost, but essentially in that order. So to look at boosting revenue, you are focused on the leadership skills, on building a vision, on being quite transformative, as opposed to being focused on the simple aspects of measuring your cost drivers, your balance sheet, which gets you into incrementalism.
So it comes partly from that wonderful phrase, which I always quote, which I think is Harry Truman, which is anything is possible just so long as you don't care who gets the credit. And the problem is it's much easier to claim, and much quicker, by the way, to claim credit for a cost reduction than it is to claim authorship of value creation or revenue increase. And so it undoubtedly biases people who are keen to justify their existence in one direction rather than the other. Is
But
that
again,
fair?
go back. It is fair, and you can go back to, we've discussed this previously, but worldly wisdom teaches us that it's better for reputation to fail conventionally than to succeed unconventionally.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, that was John Maynard Keynes in the
Yeah.
General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money in, I think,
You can tell he went to the
1936.
LSE. There you go. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, that's my one sort of flash to know the causes of things, which is the LSE motto. But that worldly wisdom allows us to look at things conventionally. So of course it's easier to take credit for your cost reductions, whereas when we're trying to drive growth, when we're trying to be original, transformative, innovative, when we're trying to solve wicked problems, my view is that marketing should come into play, should come into fore, regardless of which sector you're in, because you're bringing that absolute love and focus for customer to the table. And then the magic of marketing, and again, magic may not be a word we use in business a lot. Again, it resonates with you and I here, but we're bringing that magic of insight, inspiration, and foresight to deliver the growth plans for the future. So maybe, marketing's a wrong term for me. I mean, I've always talked about growth. I've talked about transformative growth. And when I've spoken about marketing, and culturally I've seen this, when I've spoken about marketing here in the UK, I've had this flippant comment thrown at me. So what color are the crayons?
Yeah.
Whereas when I talk about marketing in the States, we do talk about growth. We do talk about innovation. We do talk about scenario planning. All of the things that many organizations may waste, and I'm going to stress this, waste their money on by talking to the likes of a McKinsey, a Bain, or a BCG, when they could get far better insight and far better inspiration that drives growth through talking to marketeers that understand their business and the environment they're in.
I mean, what's strange about it is certainly, although it's a less reductionist and less certain process, the business of creating value through psychological insight is ultimately easier and more effective and more likely to arrive at 10x transformations
Right.
than trying to make your product 10 times cheaper, 10 times faster, 10 times bigger. And it's particularly true also because, one, it's worth noting that if you're pursuing the same kind of easy to measure metrics as everybody else, you'll become more alike your competitors, which is a bad business move to begin with. You lack, basic distinctiveness. And that's one part of it. But the second part of it is also that it at some point you run into the law of diminishing returns. I always argue, look, the reason I talk, don't get me wrong, okay, if I'd been talking in the 1840s, I would have been wildly enthusiastic about the prospect for faster trains. Okay, I'd see that 40 miles an hour isn't completely the end goal of train speed, and I still would have talked about making the journey enjoyable, but nonetheless I would have seen the point of trying to make trains faster. Now I think we have to be candid enough to admit that actually, if you beyond a certain speed, okay, you have that rather weird thing in Shanghai, didn't you? The monorail, okay? But apparently, if you look at that monorail, it actually spends only about 10 or 15 seconds at top speed in between Shanghai and the airport because it spends most of its time accelerating and then braking again.
Correct.
One of the problems with high-speed rail is it's very uneconomical to stop. Now, one of the great advantages of rail is that, unlike, for example, a flight where generally you have to go point to point, on a railway journey, you can actually, with only a few minutes added to the timetable, you can stop and serve passengers from a variety of nodes and intersections. And high-speed rail makes that difficult. I'd also make the point, by the way, it's a bit morbid, but we've never had a high-speed rail crash yet. We've had crashes of high-speed trains, but they haven't been going at maximum speed. And let's be honest, okay, if you had a train going at 400 miles an hour and it derailed, the only confident prediction you can make is that practically everybody on board would die. Okay.
Well, you get to this point, I mean,
Yeah.
take a bit of the outfit, but speed is a metric.
Yeah.
What's experience?
Well, it's
Your experience
it's
going to the
sort
railway
of measure.
station, checking in.
Yeah.
And the example I'll give you is the Eurostar.
Yeah.
Why can't I board the train immediately?
No, this
Why
is
am
a
I made
classic
to wait?
case, which is they, for some reason, they borrow from the most irritating aspect of airlines, which is that you have to hover around in a holding pen before you can board the plane.
Yeah.
Now, you might argue, okay, a plane isn't that super comfortable. If you're in economy, a plane isn't a super comfortable place to wait for 35 minutes. But that's not really true of a train, unless the train is spectacularly crowded, which, of course, the Eurostar, where all the seats are pre booked, is not. So no, that business where they've taken the most irritating feature of a plane journey and effectively injected it into a into a train. And one of my great grumbles about Euston Station is that business where they won't tell you the platform until 5 minutes before departure, while they put up that stupid message "preparing train" as though it's a cake.
But again, take that to what matters to you, the user.
Yeah.
Now, you can't measure that. I can put a metric behind the fact that there is a 30-minute wait for a train. Tick, I've
No,
ordered you in at this
stranger
minute.
still, not only can you not measure it, in most cases, I don't think you can uncover it in research, because I don't think we have introspective access to our to the origins of our feelings. Okay, there are certain things that really really upset me, and I can't genuinely explain what it is. And then if you dig a bit deeper, you can get a bit closer to the truth. But certainly the ostensible reason we give for, I'll give you a classic example, okay, which is my shop example, which is you turn up at a shop and the guy says at 5:01, "I'm sorry, we're closed." Worse still, they let you into the shop and then refuse to serve you. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the official explanation for that is you're annoyed by the inconvenience because you can't buy what you wanted to buy. Actually, it's annoying even if you weren't planning to buy anything, and you realise that deep down in the amygdala, you treat it as a personal affront. It's a mild insult.
Now, how do you capture that, and how do you measure the
Well,
experience that drives transformative growth?
I
And
think
that's a challenge. So as marketeers, so if we come
right.
is to build a narrative around that, or as I've said sometimes, to better balance the science and the romance of marketing to enact transformative change, okay, incremental change, but growth. So,
So here's what I think
the
the
cliche that
contribution.
you and I have discussed is not everything that matters can be measured, and not
Here,
everything that we measure matters. So when we
here,
get down to psychology and behavior, we know it matters. We may not have a metric for it, but if I'm sitting there looking at the most transformative organizations in the world, and let's just, sorry, because I've just got my stock
yeah.
market ticker on here, but
Oh,
you're looking at
is it terrible?
30 years
No.
ago, 30 years ago, the words when I was growing up, Apple was something I ate to keep the doctor away. Amazon was a place I wanted to go and visit. And I remember my primary school, last year at primary school teacher, telling me a goggle was like one followed by, I think, 100 zeros.
Yeah. It was. Yeah.
Now, those three words are completely different to the generation in primary school state.
Yeah.
You
Google,
know, an
Apple,
apple is a
Amazon.
phone. It's definitely not something they're going to eat at lunchtime. They should do. Let me add 1 in 5 a day, please. The Amazon is a place that's somewhere close to where Paddington lives. That he crosses over from Peru. It's something that I'm going to get me my toys on that. And obviously, a goggle or Google is something completely different. They don't have this one followed by the 100 noughts. Now, that's
So,
not
so
a,
I mean, that's
that's
the
not
fundamental
something
truth of
quite linear or
marketing, which is
rational.
that the
That was quite
fundamental.
transformative.
I
That
mean,
was just complete oblique thinking. And you have 3 of the 4 richest companies in the world now in the
what
space of 30 years.
what you have, which is also interesting, I think, is that first of all, it's people don't pay for what things are; they pay for what they mean. It might be what it means to you, it might be what it means to other people, it might be both, okay? But people fundamentally respond behaviorally and commercially in response to meaning and therefore emotional response, not objective facts. And therefore, pursuit of objective facts does not necessarily translate well into behavioral change or therefore commercial success. I mean, I'll give you a fantastic story, which is that actually, if you put 50% extra free on, a product and you put the price up 50%, actually you
Right.
sell a hell of a lot of that product. Now, an economist would go, that's completely irrational. People are just not checking the price. They're ignorant, whatever. I think it's simply because people are just noticing the deal. And they go, if I'm indifferent between these five things and there's a deal on one of them, I'll choose the one where there's a deal, without actually quantifying the value of the deal adequately. So interestingly, I mean, what I'm saying is that we respond emotionally to meaning. Meaning is context dependent. Meaning can be story dependent, it can be frame dependent, it can be anchor dependent. And our perception of everything, therefore, is not really objective. So why spend all your time perfecting the objective measures? Because it's misdirected effort to a great extent. And that's a large part of it. I mean, I'll give you a fascinating example, which I think there's a guy who invented a thing called the paceometer. And it's an alternative to the speedometer. And as well as showing your speed, it shows you around the outside of the dial the opposite of speed, which is time taken to cover a certain distance. Now, what you'll see is that obviously, okay, at 0 miles an hour, your opposite of speed is infinite because it will take you an infinite amount of time to cover 10 miles. At 60 miles an hour, it'll take you 10 minutes to cover 10 miles. Okay. What's very interesting is, of course, that the way in which the numbers go around the dial are completely different and totally uneven in the case of the pace as distinct from the speed. And what's interesting about that is it suddenly occurred to me that although they're the same thing, 10 miles a minute, 60 miles an hour are exactly the same thing, right? If our cars didn't have speed but had duration of a 10-mile journey, on the speedometer, we would drive in a completely different way.
Yeah.
Because what I learned looking at the paceometer is that actually, if you want to save time, if you want to get to your destination faster, there's a huge difference between going at 30 and going at 60. Actually, the difference between going at 60 and going at 90 is much, much less in terms of time saving. And going over 80 is kind of stupid. Okay? I mean, going over 70 is kind of unnecessary because unless you're driving for 7 hours straight, it will make barely any meaningful difference to the time of your arrival. But then we have this thing which is somehow it feels like 80 is twice as fast as 60.
And I think this is
when we're driving. I found this fascinating.
This is where marketeers come into play. You said we have this thing where it feels like when we frame things, when we marketeers really, and again, I don't think we do a good job of saying what marketing is, because at the nub of marketing is psychology, the behavioral aspects, the drivers of change that generate whether it's growth for business or whether it's better behavior. A very simple example, not that we're encouraging people to speed. Is it better to start in the British system, from 0 points and accumulate points as you speed or break traffic laws? Or do you start with 12 points and you lose points as you break laws? Which drives a better outcome for society?
Yes, because they're objectively identical, but they're not, are they?
But behaviourally, we'd probably say the second option, i.e. start with 12, start losing points. Yeah. Now, could you discuss that in a traditional boardroom? Could you discuss that around a traditional finance-led business table? Marketing has an important role. We could have a great discussion around that and come out with a simple change that has a transformative effect on behaviour. Obviously, the one, of resonating at the moment for me is voting patterns. How a simple framing of a question can change national policy, can change outcomes, can disenfranchise people, so to speak. Just a simple phrasing of a question. And again, marketing.
You gave that fantastic example, which is, do you think that the voting age should be
so the actual
extended
to
people aged 16 to 18?
The actual question is, let's get this right. Do you support or oppose reducing the voting age from 18 to 16?
Yeah.
That question has a majority, 56%, opposing.
Against. Yeah.
So if you're 16 or 17, sorry, you don't get the opportunity to vote. The second question, do you support or oppose giving 16 to 17-year-olds the right to vote? The majority, 52%, support. That is a huge difference. Same question.
Entirely driven by wording, really, isn't it? Yeah.
the difference between reducing and giving.
Giving.
One option, when you reduce, 16 to 17-year-olds don't get to vote. In the second option, when you give 16 to 17-year-olds the right to vote, it's supported by a significant majority. I mean, it's a huge change in outcomes. Now, are you going to sit there and say that with all the skills that we have in operations and finance, we'd get that? So when we look at the value of marketing now, being able to frame that debate, and I'm not being manipulative here, but that result hinges on how the question is worded. Let's not talk about Brexit or Remain. Let's not talk about Scottish referendum proposals, but the framing is critical. And that's what I mean about transformative. The impact that marketers can have is truly transformative when we start to talk about psychology, start to talk about behavior, we start to talk about impact, we start to talk about growth. So whilst we look back in history and we talk about, well, we acknowledge the great revolutions of our time, you know, the agricultural revolution of mechanizing production, the industrial revolution of sort of moving.
But by the way, what's significant about the agricultural revolution? What's significant?
But even the third revolution, the digital revolution of the automation of production, and people say we're going through this kind of smart revolution now with AI, but I call it an extension of digital and tech. The actual next big revolution for me will be this psychological revolution of capturing behavior, capturing insights, and influencing change and value.
Well, here's where I think behavioural science, and actually it goes back to a chance comment made by Amos Tversky, who is the partner of Daniel Kahneman, when he said, what Daniel and I do is we take the things that are instinctively, by which I think he could have meant tacitly known, by advertising executives and used car salesmen, and we study them in a scientific way. Now, I think what we need, okay, in order for value and perception questions to achieve comparative status to what you might call reductionist quantification questions, what we need as a first step is a taxonomy. In other words, it's a way of understanding and classifying different behavioral anomalies in humans in a way that simply allows us to ask better questions, but secondly, in a way that allows us to transfer a success in one domain into another. Because what I notice, and one of the interesting things about being in a behavioural science practice as part of an ad agency, is you have a lot of different clients. I've worked on wine, I've worked on spirits, I've worked on transportation, I've worked on airlines, obviously, I've worked on trains, I've worked on, what did I most recently do? Home decor, right? And what you notice is that there are these effective recurring patterns, okay? I'll give you an example. Just add an egg, make something a bit more difficult, and people think what they're doing is more effective. That's a famous Betty Crocker marketing case study. I'm in a conversation with a very large consumer packaged goods company, and they're talking about concentrates. And they say the problem with concentrates is that the packaging doesn't look as big, so people instinctively think they're getting worse value for money, okay? And also they tend to overdose. And I said, there's one way you could get around that, which sounds absolutely stupid, but have a concentrate of fabric conditioner, say, and get people to dilute it before they put it in. So it says, pour half of this into the cap and then add 50% water, okay? Now, there's a bit of labour illusion, there's a bit of IKEA effect, there's a bit of personal contribution. Now, of course, it's a nonsense, because once it goes into your dishwasher, or your washing machine, rather, it's diluted anyway, okay? But stripy toothpaste is stupid, because once it goes into your mouth, all the different colours are mingled together, okay? It's stupid, right? But it communicates, all right? Now, the interesting thing there is their response was fascinating. They said, well, that's weird, because we do have one concentrated product, which is a floor cleaning solution, which requires you to do this. And it's our one successful case of concentration. And now, what's so interesting about that is it's transferable learning. What tends to happen, the most depressing job in the world, okay, is being a high-end central London kitchen installer. because someone wants to sell an apartment for 8 million quid, and you can't sell an 8 million quid apartment unless it has a £90,000 kitchen, right? Some German or Swedish or small bone of devices, insanely expensive kitchen, because the person bringing the, Russian girlfriend round or whatever, if the kitchen isn't perfect, they won't buy the apartment for 8 million quid. So you install this thing to a huge level of perfection. As soon as the apartment sells, the new owner decides they want a slightly different kitchen, a modern one rather than a classic one rather than a modern one. Okay. And the same guy has to come in, trash everything he's done, okay, all his handiwork from 5 weeks before or 10 weeks before, throw it into a skip and install a different kitchen in the same place. Now, something occurs to me, the ad industry is, the marketing industry is a little bit like that. We devise insights for single use. It's like single-use plastic. We devise an insight, it proves its worth, and then basically all the other insights we might have had as part of the process end up in landfill.
Yeah.
And so that business of effectively creating a taxonomy so that we can just become better at this stuff by transferable learning strikes me as a huge opportunity.
It is. I think it's also the way we work, and not when I say we, generally organisations, and even in your world, in marketing service agency, being very siloed. I don't know how well creative, strategy, planning, client account directors work well together, and how they work across each other. But certainly, when we talk about transferable learnings, the insights, and I've been quite fortunate, from P&G. An example I can give you is how very early on in my career, I took insights from, believe it or not, diapers or Pampers brand, and applied them to the business I was leading, which was fine fragrances and Hugo Boss. And what's diapers got to do with prestige fragrances? Well, actually, a lot when you look at sampling strategies.
Yeah,
actually, a lot when you look at targeting. It's when you can break out of that siloed thinking and work more collaboratively. I think that's where the magic happens. And suddenly you have transformative action.
Roger L. Martin makes a good point, which is that in a very hard-headed business environment.
If I just give you another example, you take a traditional industry like insurance, and whilst I was at Rory Sutherland, being able to take learnings from Orange and how we treated customers and applying them within insurance, or the flavour of the time then, this was post The Future's Bright, The Future's Orange, was how O2 was treating its existing customers with its rewards. I wanted to get back to O2 because you attributed that to me. But there's the Orange case study that we used and the O2 rewards case study for treating existing customers well, and how we applied that in the insurance sector. Across other areas, particularly in the charity sector or the healthcare space, how we look at, I chair an organisation due to the neurological condition, but how you look at those other conditions, other healthcare dilemmas, whether it's heart health or what Alzheimer's have done well as regards brain health, and how we pull that into other conditions, how we transfer learnings. I think that's where the magic is. And again, coming back to the role of marketers and how they can build their influence, is gaining all this insight and being able to pull it into their own sector, their own industry, or their own brand. And I think marketeers have that ability and skill. You may say they also need to be given the platform, which is harder here in the UK than, for example, the USA.
I also think that you need to create a business environment where metaphorical conversation is allowed. Because Roger L. Martin makes that point, that people who talk in metaphors, Roger L. Martin says that the very hard-headed business culture regards it as fanciful, whereas in reality it's a very, very important creative function in understanding how learning in one area can be transferred to another.
Right.
One of the most fascinating things when I talked about that business of increasing the capacity of the West Coast Main Line by simply allowing people to board earlier trains when they were empty, okay? What fascinated that about me is it's absolutely obvious, okay, if you were at a wedding and there was a line of cars or minibuses, okay, you'd wait for every minibus to be full, okay, before it set off. You wouldn't, okay. When you evacuate the US Embassy compound in Saigon, you fill every helicopter with waiting evacuees, right? You wouldn't say, I'm terribly sorry, mate, you're booked on the 12:30 helicopter flight, so you'll have to wait while this helicopter leaves half empty, right? Now, for some weird reason, psychological blind spot, that's not obvious when it comes to trains.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know why that is. It's completely obvious with a car, with a minibus, with a helicopter. Absolutely obvious. You fill up everyone, maximise the capacity of the conveyance. Weirdly, that isn't obvious with trains. Isn't it strange?
But I think you've mentioned a key word there, which is blind spots. So when we look
Yeah.
at our organisations, particularly in the UK, I always say that marketing is a blind spot, whether you're in the private sector, the public sector, or civil society and charities. Marketing is a blind spot.
Hmm.
So being able to ask, the balance here, those simple questions. Well, if it works there, why doesn't it work here? Or how do
Yes.
we take this and apply it to that? How do I take the magic of the Disney experience and apply it in a sector not versed in customer service? And I think being able to ask those questions should be a skill that marketers bring to the table.
So a classic transference one would be NHS waiting lists. You could turn the wait into, if not a benefit, a non-negative, by framing it as preparation for your operation,
Right.
and by using it as an opportunity to make a fuss of the person waiting. So
Yeah.
where have you stolen that idea from? Well, actually, Shmuel at Dishoom, who, when people are queuing for the restaurant, okay, brings them a cup of chai.
Exactly.
Okay.
So again, it's a framing. We mentioned
Yeah.
framing before. It's a framing of waiting. And, for decades, we've been trying to solve this issue of wait lists in the NHS, but it's this reductionist theory. We're looking at these just marginal improvements of how do we phase operations, how do we focus on a specialty, how do we bring certain people in certain days. Whereas we could probably transform the way the most important person here, the patient, so you have the clinician and the nursing staff, but the way the patient is feeling if we frame it a certain way. Now, with one of my other hats, with a healthcare hat on, I look at the benefits that you have from healthy eating, a better diet, meditation, just general lifestyle elements that can be part of a waiting experience that prepare you for surgery or prepare you for a procedure, but also generate better outcomes
And
because
you
you're
could
physically
genuinely,
and
I'm sure,
psychologically better prepared. Well, we
absolutely.
could address wait lists if we frame them differently, and then, of course, put an operating model and resources around that framing. So suddenly wait lists don't become such a big problem to the patient. Of course, if you have an emergency, within our jewel in the crown, our fabulous NHS, you can be seen quickly. But in terms of the average person, reframing it and building an operating model around that is something that, as marketeers, we could aid the solutions for. But in terms of the traditional people who are working on this, that I always say to you are quite traditional, linear, left brain, metric focused, they miss the magic. Whereas marketeers can combine that with a dose of creativity and expand our solutions.
And it's a bit worse than that, because they don't only miss the magic, they mistrust the magic in many cases. And of course, magic, it is worth noting, magic is slightly unreliable. It requires testing, experimentation. You can't make totally confident pronouncements in any marketing matter, because human response is always has an element of sort of uncertainty to it.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, what you can do is experiment and replicate your successes, which is, I think, the territory we should be. We should. I think we should be. To be honest, I think we should be honest about this. I think we're making the attempt to frame a marketing as an exact science, in order to gain respectability, by suggesting that performance marketing online can be turned into this perfectible thing. I don't think it can be, because the future is to some degree unknowable, and human behavior is to some degree perverse. Okay.
But this is where we come back to this definition of it's not about coloring crayons. We're talking about growth. But
Yeah.
now we come to the drivers of psychology and behavioral science and what marketing can truly give. So yes, we have insight. I also talk about inspiration. We have creativity, which we can give in doses, but creativity has to be valued, and you need a degree of experimentation there. So the value of marketing is vast. We started off this conversation around the love for the customer, but that love has to be exemplified, not just through the basics of insight, but inspiration and more. So we start to balance, not marketing as some people try to see it now as a complete science, but an art. And just because we've talked about healthcare, if you speak to some of the best physicians, some of the best surgeons and clinicians, and those from probably more an older school, they will talk about medicine as being both a science and an art. And I think that's what we've lost in many of our disciplines, but certainly in marketing, the artistic element being valued, because we've taken this reductionist approach to metricize, to make it work,
Yes.
as much as possible to tick boxes. And we've left the magic behind, the transformative effects behind. And yet we talk about the Amazons, the Apples, and the Googles and what have you, but we forget about the inspiration, the magic that got them to be where they are.
It's worth noting that all those people, the founders of all those organizations, and there's no more extreme case actually than Edison, were in many ways, they were in many ways showmen every bit as much as they were. In fact, I mean, Jobs among the hardcore tech community at Apple was widely disliked. I mean, one famous quote was, I don't understand what Steve does, like he can't even code. Okay. And there's a famous one, which is a comment among absolute Apple tech enthusiasts on the launch of the iPod, which was just what the world needs, another portable music player, you know. And it was, it was technological purism, which disliked the fact that as much of Apple's fortunes actually rested on what you might call magic and a kind of reality distortion field that exists around the brand, every bit as much as technological superiority. But no one whose stock in trade is tech improvement wants to believe that.
That element of, yes, magic, but also respect. And let's go back to this love the customer. And an example I'll give you from Orange is a wonderful quote. You mentioned the CEO at the time, and look, I remember, I think it's 1998, 1999, had a product meeting presenting to hands on the board, and we had some complaints about voicemail. Obviously, it's a long time ago, and I remember Hans's comment, which was, "Well, if you turn the phone off, no problem." So where's the product manager for the off button? That's counterintuitive, because if you have your phone on, you'd be earning money from the voicemail revenue, etc. It's counterintuitive to the business model, but it's perfectly intuitive to the consumer model and the need to better understand and please those whom you're serving. And if you do that well, revenue follows. And we know the story after that in terms
And
of
actually, had there been a product manager for the off button,
no, but it's just the insight is so rich, isn't it? It gets you to think a different way.
Yeah. So first of all, okay, what are the two worst things about turning a mobile phone off? One, it takes ages to turn it back on again. So can you have a sleep? Secondly, if you have a sleep function instead of an off function, can you get it to wake up by default in 2 hours' time so you don't spend 8 hours being uncontactable because your phone's in silent mode? Those are the kind of questions which would have been asked, I think, had that job title existed. Brilliant.
So it differently, you ask different questions, and then you deliver to a customer experience.
Well, of course, the other thing Orange did, which was it was enabled by technological superiority, but it was something they didn't need to do, which was per second billing.
Right.
Because, of course, everybody who then had an analog Cellnet and Vodafone phone, if you rang someone and you got their answer phone, you paid 50p for that call, even though it only lasted half a second.
Right.
And the point about that, it was highly profitable, but it was extremely annoying to a large swathe of people. So they were prepared to make that decision to wave goodbye to a whole chunk of gratuitous revenue. And
I'll use the word bundling as well. So the bundle minutes innovation, is to help change behavior. So you normalize behavior.
Yes, so you actually felt making a 7-minute call because it was pre-bundled wasn't necessarily an act of gross extravagance.
Exactly. And even with text messaging, I mean, let's be fair, I think technologically, initially, all of us, all the operators couldn't bill for it.
No, that's right.
It influenced behavior. So people became adept at text messaging. when billing was introduced. And obviously that's moved on now as data, i.e. text, is free, but it impacted and influenced behavior. And I remember doing this at Orange with just getting people to take their phones abroad, pre-provisioning international direct dial, pre-provisioning roaming.
Really
So instead of
interesting.
using the expensive hotel phone or sending a postcard, let's be honest, we'd all love to get more postcards, but you had an option and you were able to change behavior. But they were simple changes that had more seismic effects. And I think that's where the magic of marketers can come in, looking at simple changes, or you might even say simple nudges that have significant effects that you don't have to re-engineer a whole division or a whole company. And I'll just go back to that question we looked at on voting intentions and giving 16, 17-year-olds the right to vote by either lowering the age or giving them the right. Simple changes can have transformative effects. And I think marketeers can really play in that space and broaden the discussion, but also bring in these transferable insights from outside of their sector and industry.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, I think that is actually perfect. What I'd like to do is um, gift this to the wonderful people on my course. First and foremost, the conversation, but secondly, to hold a follow up, maybe towards the end of the course, which would be highly complementary, I think, to some of the other conversations we've been having, not least with people like Shamil, for example, or with the School of Marketing, of course. And I think this is really, really interesting. I think this has been absolutely tremendous. So thank you very much indeed.
Brilliant. Thank you for the opportunity, Rory. Good luck with it all.